Seeing Ultimate Wolverine dominate Omega Red is pretty amazing. So, we are back with Ultimate Wolverine. And what this does is this initially picks up with Sabertooth going to visit Logan. Now here's a cool thing about this, right? That they're not really enemies the way that we're traditionally used to. In fact, Sabertooth was part of the opposition to Colossus, his sister Magic, and Omega Red. But one of the things that goes on is that, one, he knows Wolverine's not really sleeping, right? So he kind of wakes him up. But he also asks him for a favor. And this is a really, really cool moment between these guys because he says, I came with some news, which is to say, I came to say goodbye. And he's just like, I'm leaving. And Wolverine's initially taken aback by this, right? He's like, so you're gonna abandon us after everything that's gone on? And that's kind of the crazy thing about this, is because the opposition has been around for quite some time. While the Ultimate Universe as it stands now is a universe that was essentially created by the Maker because he screwed with time, all we really know about the Eurasian Republic is that it's ruled over by Colossus, Magic, and Omega Red. The opposition seemingly rose in response to that, and it's kind of been composed of various members of the mutant community that we've known over the years. Mikhail Rasputin leads it, but you've also got Black Widow, who's not really a mutant. You have Gambit and a few other people. But one of the things that we learned that had been going on for quite some time was that Sabertooth had been trying to rescue Wolverine after he had basically been taken by the Eurasian Republic and turned into the Winter Soldier. And so now that he's back, Wolverine's just kind of like, okay, tell me what's going on. And that's where Sabertooth says, those two kids that I was hiding in Smolensk, Artie and Leech, they're not over the border. They're still here, partly because I asked them to stay. They're like us. They don't have any family, and I've taken a liking to them, and since they don't have anybody and I don't have anybody, we just sort of became family. And so he's like, it's my job to look after them. And he says, I just know that there's no future for them in this place. If they stay, they may die. And who knows what the Eurasian Republic has planned for us. I'm going to take them somewhere else, right? Someplace safe. I'm going to raise them, protect them, give them a good life away from all of this. And that's where Wolverine asks, did you tell Mikhail? Because the reality here is that when it comes to a group like the opposition, for all the good they do in trying to oppose the forces of the Eurasian Republic, they're not that dissimilar from the Eurasian Republic, which is to say, it's not a group that you just walk away from very easily. You need to have a very good reason for why. And they might even send their people after you if you simply just leave. And that's what Sabertooth is concerned about. He says, I can't, right? I know the speech that he'd give. The movement's more important than the individual, but these are good kids, Logan, and I care about them. And so that's when you get this really interesting perspective of Sabertooth, because Wolverine responds and he says, it sounds like you've already made up your mind, right? I can't say that I blame you, but this is not a good time for the opposition. We've been taking losses, and Sabertooth recognizes that. He says, look, I know, right? I totally get that, but I don't want to see these two be among the people that we've lost. I know that you think that I didn't keep my promise to you, but I tried. I went digging around, and I found this. It's called the Muramasa blade. Legend has it that it can cut keener than any other blade made by man. They say that it can cut through the soul. They also say it may be the only thing that can actually kill one of us healers. Now, here's an important thing to understand about the Muramasa blade, because the one that you see here is actually a combination of both blade variants in the main Marvel Universe. So sidestepping this comic for a second, the Muramasa blade is the only weapon in the Marvel Universe that can actually kill Wolverine permanently, which is to say, it can cut through adamantium and it shuts down Wolverine's healing factor. Now, there are ways around it, right? Say, for example, you were to stab Wolverine through the chest with the Muramasa blade, and then in turn, he were to cut around that actual stab wound and pull that chunk of skin out, it would actually start to heal normally. So it only really affects that one itty-bitty area, but of course, it would also impact the heart, and there's various other things that go with it. The original Muramasa blade, which was made by Muramasa himself, was black, and sometimes it's called the Black Blade, oftentimes it's confused with the Ebony Blade in Marvel Comics, but the long and short of the original Muramasa blade was that Muramasa himself put his own soul in the sword. And so more often than not, it just turns the person into a more capable fighter. Not only that, the sword grants some modifications in terms of durability and different things like that, but truth to tell, if you took the Muramasa blade and you put it in the hands of somebody like me, who had no idea what to do with a sword, I'd get myself killed, right? Whereas if you put it in the hands of someone who is prodigious and knows how to use a sword, yeah, they're going to tear you apart, and you're not really going to stand much of a fighting chance. Here's the caveat to the original Muramasa blade, that those individuals who wield that sword will ultimately succumb to its bloodlust. That's why it's oftentimes confused with the ebony blade, because they do share that concept together. The second Muramasa blade, which is the one that looks like the one that you see here, that was fashioned out of Wolverine's soul, hence the reason why it can actually kill Wolverine. But regardless of how you slice it, it's still an incredibly deadly weapon. And so when this is given to Wolverine, Sabertooth just says, right, maybe you can give it to Kitty or Mikhail just in case. All I ask in return is that you make me a promise. And the question of Wolverine is like, okay, well, what kind of promise are we talking about? And that's where Sabertooth says, do not tell anyone about me and the kids. Give us time. Let us disappear. And that's where Wolverine simply just says, that I think I can manage. Now, up to this point, right, when you switch over to Colossus, Magic, and Omega Red, one of the things to keep in mind here is that Colossus did not know that his brother Mikhail was leading the opposition. And so he's essentially finding out for the first time that his own family is standing against him, which is kind of the inverse of how it's always been in Marvel Comics. Colossus was always the good guy on the side of the X-Men, and Mikhail was usually the bad guy on the side of whatever organization he was a part of at that point in time. The guy's very much an opportunist, if not incredibly powerful in his own right. But now it's the opposite. But that's one of the things that frustrates Colossus, because he asks, how is it that I have only just learned this? How did we not know that my brother was running the opposition? And the response is, Leader Rasputin, it took some time to piece the footage together. They disrupted the signal somehow, and we essentially had to lay eyes on. At least that seems to be what he's indicating. Now, the concern of Colossus here is actually justified, because while there's a lot of explanations on the kind of things that Mikhail can do, and people I think often draw it out and make it more complicated than it needs to be, the long and short of Mikhail Rasputin's powers is that he has the ability to manipulate subatomic energy, but more so than that, he can manipulate other people's powers. He usually uses his powers to kind of like teleport around. That's what he's historically done in Marvel. But more so than that, being able to shut down or overpower another person by taking control of their powers, that's the real concern here. That's the real issue that Colossus has, assuming that those powers are the same. Because if Colossus were to face off against his brother, Colossus would stand a pretty decent chance, just because of the fact that his abilities are not energy-based. But someone like Magic, well, at that point, it becomes a whole different beast. And so at the end of the day, Colossus feels worse off now than they did before, because not only has his own family turned against him, which is just a shot to the gut, they still don't know where the opposition is located at, and the opposition is successfully launching guerrilla warfare tactics, taking out various arms and armament components that belong to the Eurasian Republic. But that's when Dr. Prostovich walks in. Now, Dr. Prostovich, keeping in mind, she's the one that kind of runs the Weapons Plus program, and the one that turned Wolverine into the Winter Soldier. And she says, my team may have discovered something of interest. And that's where Colossus says, then interest me, Director Prostovich. And she says, we tasked 3 Sentinel units to survey the western border. They found nothing out of the ordinary until we realized it was not ordinary at all. This plot of land that I'm showing you here is the Chernobyl power plant. And of course, Colossus is like, look, I don't get the point of why you're telling me this. I mean, there's clearly nothing there. And that's where she says that's the issue. There should be something there, but it's gone missing somehow. A digital search also came back the same way. Empty land. But I took the liberty of sending a small reconnaissance team with analog equipment, and they came back with this. The plant still exists, only it's missing from all databases and files and will not appear on any digital photography or scans. Now, the initial thought of Magic is that it's a telepath, but the response of Prostovich is no, right? It kind of is, but it's kind of not. Someone who can manipulate cyberspace, but further analog reconnaissance at the area has uncovered a small group working at the plant, working primarily at night, moving pallets of aid and weapons in and out, trucks carrying individuals. Now, that's an important thing to know here, is because the opposition has Legion, and while Legion isn't necessarily the David Haller that we're familiar with, right? Thousands of personalities, each one with a power, while he did die at a very young age, and it was believed that he was basically killed by the Maker, he kept his consciousness alive and backed his consciousness up into a computer system. That's that's where he resides. And as a member of the opposition, he controls cyberspace. So that's why this whole plant is not showing up here. And so at that moment, Omega Red chimes in and says, Director, the plant is dead, right? The core was breached and the plant was abandoned. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And Prostovich fires back. She says, perhaps there is a mutant who can absorb the residual radiation, or that too was a deception. However, I do believe that this is genuine. We have discovered the hidden headquarters of the opposition. And the question of Colossus is, does that mean we should drop the Cerebro bomb? Now, here's a crazy thing, and it's one of the easy things to forget when it comes to the Eurasian Republic. They have Xavier, and they have Jean Grey, or technically they have their brains, but they have the minds of the 2 most powerful telepaths in the world. We haven't quite figured out everything they're doing with them outside of brainwashing people or mutants into becoming super soldiers, but if they're developing a Cerebro bomb, this is probably exactly what it sounds like. Something akin to what we saw in like the Logan film, right? A telepathic attack, if only incidental, so extreme that it basically kills everybody in its immediate vicinity. And that's probably what's going to be happening here. But the response of Prostovich is no, right? The bomb is not ready. Another 2 weeks at least, perhaps 3 or 4. We're making progress, but using it now would be folly. And so the question is, then what? What's your suggestion? Do we just sit around and twiddle our thumbs and wait until your bomb is ready and then hope they're there when we drop it? The response she has here is no, right? A ground assault. And that's when Omega Red chimes in and says 100%, right? The battlefield calls to me. And so at that point, you pick up with Sabertooth basically sneaking out with the kids, Wolverine watching the whole thing and just making sure that nobody catches them or anything like that. But in the midst of all of this, missiles come flying into the base, and Omega Red launches his attack against everyone here. And immediately, he goes after Wolverine. Now, here's the kicker about this, right? We don't necessarily have the nitty-gritty details of how Omega Red became Omega Red. We can largely assume that it's very much the same way as it is in the main Marvel Universe. He was basically a psychopath who ended up becoming a part of what was, in effect, Russia's version of Weapons Plus, right? Developing super soldiers using carbonadium, a cheap knockoff version of adamantium, instead of the actual adamantium itself. And you'll see what I'm talking about here, because a lot of the elements of Omega Red remain the same. The only difference here is he doesn't really know about Wolverine. They don't really have any history together. The only thing that he knows about him is that at one point he was the Winter Soldier. And he says that, right? He says, I know you. Did you forget your way home? Our little Winter Soldier. And so Wolverine looking at the sword, Omega Red realizing Wolverine's looking at the sword, Wolverine goes for it. And then a couple of Sentinels attack and basically throw him off. At that point, Omega Red snares him up in his tentacles and then just says, you've gotten sloppy in your work. Director Prostovich may be able to fix that for you. And then he says, and this, right, picking up the sword, it's like, do you want it? Right, what is it, Winter Soldier? A sword. But what does this sword do? And the response of Wolverine, it's none of your business, right? Slashes one of the tentacles of Omega Red and then literally gashes this guy through the shoulder. Now, Omega Red has a healing factor, so despite being stabbed in the shoulder and then despite being stabbed in the arm, it's not enough to kill him, but it is enough to at least injure Omega Red momentarily. And this is where I say the familiar nature of his character comes into play, in the sense that he feeds on the life force of other people through his carbonadium tentacles to keep himself alive. Notice, there is no mention of a carbonadium synthesizer, so that doesn't really seem to be a part of his lore in the Ultimate Universe. But the fact is, right, he just absorbs the life force off of a couple of guys and just says, your friends abandon you. And at that point, all the other members of the opposition show up, right? Red Guardian, Black Widow, Gambit, Blink, the whole 9 yards, Iceman, Mikhail. And here's a crazy thing about this, and this is up for interpretation, and I want to know how you guys feel about this, because what goes on here is that Mikhail says, Arcady, have you come to join us too? And Arcady says no, right? Rostovich is just like, no, you have betrayed the Republic and your family. Treason is a crime punishable by death, but you commit treason against your brother and sister, against your friend. I have come to destroy you. And the response of Mikhail is this: you are, as ever, mistaken, old friend. And that's an important statement, because we don't necessarily know what it means, but it's entirely possible he's a double agent. It's entirely possible that he's actually here as a spy, and not even Omega Red knows that that's what's going on. But the fact is, it doesn't make any difference anyway, because in that moment, Wolverine pops his claws, has the sword in his hand, and goes charging at Omega Red. And where a great big huge fight breaks out, we don't necessarily see what happens to Omega Red in the moment. Instead, what happens is you switch back over to Colossus, right? And one of his generals walk in. He says, "Leader Rasputin, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have news." And of course, Colossus is like, what news do you have? And the guy says, "From the Chernobyl operation, sir, only this box has returned thus far. It says it is from your brother, Mikhail. I did not look inside." And Colossus responds, "Bring it to me." And when he cracks it open, there's a letter attached to it that says, "Dearest brother and sister, I must return your gift as I found it unacceptable." And when the box is opened up, it's Omega Red's own head, right? It's a scene out of 7, right? What's in the box? They cut his head off and sent it back to Colossus with the second half of the note reading, "Do not send a Rosovich to do a Rasputin's job." That's pretty brutal, man. That's pretty hardcore. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, and I will catch you all later. Peace.